average working person, like Jack when he was going off to the factories and came home to his mother, and they barely had enough to survive sometimes, they're not going to be thinking about the beauty of the objects, right? It takes a certain kind of financial underground, and so here, this is from England, and it's again a satire. It says, you know, there's the Duchess at work, and here are all the members of this hoity-toity aristocratic family doing their arts and crafts. Well, of course they didn't, you know. It was only a very small segment of artistic-oriented people at that time who were into it. And what's amazing is how much it's survived and has spread really throughout the country, so that today's designers and architects are very aware of this movement and borrow from it. And Charmian, you have to remember, lived in a household where she had a maid when she was working. So she could do arts and crafty stuff because she didn't have to wash her undies, you know. She might sew them because that would be very arts and crafty. She might make them, and she did make a lot of her underwear. But she didn't have to clean them, and so that's an important distinction. So if you think of the Snark, of course, is very arts and crafty. Here it is. It's made basically by very skilled people. You can go to seaports where they still do this kind of building, like in Connecticut or Massachusetts. And you have men who still, and women, who have this craft. It's been continued. But it's generally not the way boats are made anymore. And what was interesting about the Snark is Jack pretty much decided on the design. So, you know, it was his creation. And he went so far as to insist that these logs, the hull, which has a natural curve to it, that they had to find trees that already had the curve that was needed for the hull. I mean, that's how precise he was about the building of the ship, rather than having the wood steamed and reshaped and manipulated, which would have been the normal process. So there they are, they're looking at the Snark. Of course, he was cheated. That you could just spend a whole class on the craziness of the building of the Snark. Here's what it was like on the inside. So when you're reading about them, you can see they have separate cabins because they slept separately all the time. And so and there's a toilet. And the tiny galley for cooking. I don't know how people managed to cook in there. And then the main cabin would have been where the other men slept, or they slept up on deck. On top of the boat, there was also a lifeboat. And you'll see Charmian talk about, I read in the lifeboat, or Jack was sleeping in the lifeboat. So it seems to have been like an extra room in a way for them. There's this colorized picture of the Snark when it was finished. And let's see, how long is this room, would we guess? The Snark was just a bit longer than this, but it wasn't very wide. And you're on that, you know, for months. Going to Hawaii, you're on it for how many weeks? 6 weeks, I think. And all you see is water, and goonies, and fish, and dolphins, and other wonderful creatures that she writes about. I think the key to understanding the Snark, remember, they think they're going to go around the world, and Charmian doesn't have any idea that what's going to happen, or that she'll even do a book. But when you look at what they were doing and what came out of it in terms of the Snark, they are traveling through colonies. Each of the places they went to was colonized by some one Western nation, right? And everywhere she goes, she talks about who's taken over, who are the rulers. They get invited, of course, to meet the haughty-taughty people, the governors and all of that. And they know how to behave with those people because they're proper East Bay bourgeois. They can play that. It's not their real selves when they're in those scenes. They're clearly much more comfortable with the indigenous people, the people whose cultures formed there and whose history is there, and learning from those people and collecting from those people. So when you go to the ranch, you'll see a lot of the objects that she writes about in the book. And another thing about it being a trip to colonization is, as you go further and further to the Solomons, the skin colors get darker. And she's very clear about describing the shades of people and their hair and the decorating. And by the time she gets to the Solomons, it's almost a caricature of racism then. I mean, the way she talks about the islanders there, and I know Iris will go into that at some point. So when you're reading the Snark, you can think about who was in charge, when did they take over. She doesn't really say when the Dutch or the Germans took over, or the French. You might want to go into a little of that prehistory in terms of one of the cultures that you're looking at. She talks about cultural oppression. She's really alert to the fact, and Jack is later in his stories, that the colonization process is terrible to the people, that it's destructive, that he talks about the inevitable white man, and people see that as, well, he's like Nietzschean, he wants to be the, top of the line. Well, actually, he's using it ironically. The inevitable white man is what cruelty we can bring. And he has a number of stories where that is the point, and yet people read them and don't know about irony. They just don't understand. She writes about racism, and this is going to be very controversial. There's no doubt about it. Gender changes. She notes in different cultures how the women are treated with regard to the men. So in one, she's not allowed to go with Jack to some places because there are taboos about Marys. And Marys cannot go to these places or see these rituals. But that's only in the case in that one particular group. In another group, she can go everywhere. So she's very alert to that. And that's so unusual for anybody at that time to be writing that way. And then she loves to write about the people and their practices and how they dress and the stories they tell. So here's an example of, colonization. Here's the men in their native dress, but there they have the Victrola, and that Victrola, they're wonderful scenes about Jack and Charmian bringing out the Victrola and playing opera, and the natives, they hear beautiful music and they dance to it. They think it's really, really wonderful. Women are always more oppressed during colonization, and here you see these women have had to cover their bodies all the way top to bottom, and yet there's a woman with her non-native musical instrument. So is that good? Is it bad? What is it? I mean, we are all talking about these issues even today, about identity and, is it good that she was given that instrument, or should she have been not given? I don't know. I think the answer is a complicated one. I talked about Charmian being both a public and a private person. I think these dresses, these two pictures, really show it. This one is about of the Snark. It's a publicity shot taken for a newspaper, and she's all very fixed up for it, and with her hat. She loved hats. Boy, the woman, I don't know, hats and shoes. She was a fashionista. It's another thing I liked about her. Here, she's in an outfit that she made for herself, and she's rowing a boat. Perfectly able and happy. She's always smiling. It's very rare to find a picture of Charmian not just very happy and having a good time. Another way that she broke convention is that she was the only woman aboard the boat, and there are actually superstitions about women on ships, and in fact, there were other trips that they wanted to take where it was difficult to get her permission to go on the trip, and they had to actually argue with the captain because of this superstition at the time that women were bad luck. Actually, if it wasn't for her, half the crew you could have thrown in the water and forgotten them completely. I mean, she and Jack and Martin Johnson were the most capable people on the ship in the early part. She wasn't afraid, she took on men's tasks also. Charmian began hunting as a teenager. She was very much had all of the outdoor skills of hunting and fishing from an early age, and she learned some of them from another woman artist who was a friend of hers, and they would go out hunting together. And she was known to be quite the crack shot. I love the scene of the ocean in the second one. You can see how wild it is. You really get a better sense of how dangerous the trip could be at times. Explored fearlessly. Well, this is what's missing. I had a few more pictures that you'll get in the final version. There were a couple of deleted episodes in the book. One was when they had to leave and go back to San Francisco, and they take a steamer, and she doesn't really write about that. This is the infamous hashish party, which is written in detail in her diary, where it's on the Solomon Islands, and they all dressed up in costumes, as you can see, and smoked hash and partied for several days, getting high together inside the compound, hoping that, of course, the slaves who lived around there weren't going to attack at some point. Sexuality. This slide will include a photo that Charmian took of a native woman, totally nude, and she did a number of these photographs. She did a lot of photography. But as she noted, she always admired the human body, and she just didn't understand why people couldn't admire nudity. And so I had to include that. And then the most important thing, of course, is the book. And she went to Europe after Jack died and was able to get a good translator of her book into French. And the man who wrote the preface, Alain Gerbol, was a noted flyer of the time, so he was a very important celebrity to do the actual preface thing. And today, the French version is readily available. The American versions of her books are only now available, but when I started doing the research, I had to buy original first editions, because that's all there was. Fortunately, nobody was buying them then, so I was able to get them at a decent price. But the fact that you've been able to actually use her book is a big breakthrough. So are there any questions?